The crowbar had been working at the same plank for the better part of an hour, and the plank had not yet given. Tess crouched in the cold blue dark of the cabin, her breath standing white in the lamplight, and felt the iron bite at last into the seam she had been chasing. Outside, the wind came down off the high country and pressed against the log walls, and the walls answered it with the small ticking sounds. Old timber makes, she set her shoulder behind the bar. The nail heads, square and hand-cut, lifted a finger's width and held. Under that one board, where the seller had sworn there was nothing but packed dirt and field mice, something had been waiting in the dark a long time, and it was about to be looked at by the first honest eye in years. She did not pry it. The rest of the way, not yet. A person who has been taught well learns to slow down at the exact place where a careless person hurries, and she had been taught very well. She sat back on her heels and let the lamp throw its yellow over the floor and the lifted plank in her own chapped hands, and she made herself look at what she already had before she reached for more. That was the whole of the lesson the old man had left her, if it could be put in one sentence. Look at the thing in front of you until it tells you the truth, and do not let any man tell it for you. To understand why a young woman was alone in a dead trapper's cabin in the Bitterroot foothills in the autumn of 1879, prying up a floor that did not yet belong to her, you have to go back a little. You have to go back to the man who taught her, and to the 4 months before this night, and to the morning she handed over the last money she had in the world for a lodge that everyone in the valley agreed was empty. Her name was Tess Marlowe, and she was 28 years old, and she had come west from a tanyard in the river country, with the only inheritance her teacher had been able to give her, which was not money. Otho Lund had been a furrier and a tanner, a Norwegian who had crossed an ocean and most of a continent and ended his days dressing hides in a shed that smelled of bark liquor and lime. He was not her blood. He had taken her in when she was a half-grown girl with nowhere to be, and he had set her to work, and over the years the work had become a skill, and the skill had become the one thing nobody could take from her. He taught her to read a pelt the way a banker reads a ledger. He taught her that a marten was not a marten, that there were grades and there were seasons, that prime fur cut in the deep of winter was worth 4 times the same animal taken thin in the spring. He taught her the private marks that honest dealers used to grade and tally their stock, a small shorthand of nicks and crosses inked on a slip or pressed into the leather so that a man could leave a bale of furs in a cache and know to the dollar what it held without ever untying it. He died in the spring of that year quietly, in his chair, with a half-grated mink skin still in his lap. There was almost nothing to bury him with and less to live on after the shed went to the man who held the note on it. What Tess kept was a worn skinning knife with a handle the color of dock honey, a tin box of grating slips in his own hand, and the knowledge in her own 2 hands. She was not a woman who wept easily, and she did not weep then. She folded what she had into a carpet bag and bought passage as far west as the money reached, because Otho had always said the trade was richest where the cold was hardest, and the cold was hardest in the far mountains. What she did not yet know was that the mountain country had already been quietly emptied of its trappers, one, by a man who had never set a single trap in his life. She came into the valley town in early summer with $11 and a trade nobody had asked for. The town was a rail spur and a freight road and a row of false-fronted buildings leaning into the wind, and the largest of those buildings carried the painted name of a fur and land concern, and the largest man in that building was the factor who ran it. His name was Harlan Voss. He was a broad, soft-spoken man in a good coat, with hands that had never been cut by the work he profited from. And he had a way of listening to a person that made them feel, for a moment, that they had been heard. Tess would learn in time what that listening was worth. On the first day it only seemed like the one warm thing in a hard place, and she was grateful for it the way the cold are grateful for any fire. She asked him for work, grading pelts. He looked at her hands, which were a working woman's hands, and he looked at the skinning knife she carried, and something passed behind his eyes that she took at the time for respect. He did not give her work. He told her gently that the trapping in the valley had fallen off, that the old lines had gone quiet, that there was simply not the fur there had once been. He said it the way a man closes a door he does not want you to see is locked. Then, almost as an afterthought, as she was turning to go, he mentioned that he had a property for sale, a trapper's lodge up the Bitterroot Fork, well built, sound roof, going cheap, because the trapper who held it had died without kin, and the place stood empty. He said down the word empty, the way a card player lays a low card he wants you to believe is the only one in his hand. She rode up to look at it 3 days later on a hired mule. The lodge sat in a fold of the foothills, where a cold creek came down out of the pines, a low cabin of squared logs with a stone chimney, and a steep roof shingled in cedar shakes, gone silver with weather. The door hung true. The hearth was swept. It had the particular emptiness of a place that has not merely been left, but cleaned out, every hook bare, every shelf wiped, the smell of wood smoke long gone cold. A person who did not know the trade would have called it empty and meant it. Tess stood in the doorway with the afternoon light falling past her onto the bare floor, and she did not think the word empty. She thought a different word. Otho had kept a saying for a place that had been stripped too carefully, swept too clean. Such a place, he used to say, is not empty. Such a place has been searched. She bought it for $9, which was nearly every dollar she had, and Voss sold it to her with a smile and a folded bill of sale. And 3 men in the freight office laughed when they heard the furrier girl had bought the dead man's empty cabin to live alone in like a hermit. One of them said she had paid $9 for a roof, and a winter of being snowed in with the ghosts. Voss did not laugh with them. He watched her ride out with her carpet bag, and his face had gone still and careful, the way a man's face goes when he has done a thing he is not certain was wise. She would learn his name for what the cabin held only later. For now, she had a roof, and the trade in her hands, and the whole long summer ahead to learn the country. The cabin was the smallest part of what Otho had bought her with all those years of teaching. The largest part had not been found yet, and it would take her the better part of a season to find it. If you have ever owned a thing the world insisted was worthless, you already understand the patience this required. She did not begin by prying up floors. She began the way Otho would have begun, by living in the place until it stopped being a stranger to her. She cut firewood and chinked the gaps in the logs where the wind came through. She mended the cedar shakes that had curled and split. She set a few traps of her own along the creek, more to learn the ground than for the fur, and she dressed what she caught and graded it by the old marks out of long habit, and she sold the little she had at the spur and was paid less than it was worth because she was new and a woman and alone. None of that surprised her. Otho had warned her that the world would always offer her less than her work was worth, and that the only defense was to know the worth exactly, so that the offering of less could never become a believing of less. It was in the 2nd month that the cabin began to speak to her. She noticed the small things a careless eye slides over. The floorboards were planed and fitted, the work of a man who took pride, and yet in the center of the room one short stretch of board did not match the rest. It was the same wood, the same age, but the nail head sat a hair proud of the surface, as if those boards had been lifted and set back more than once. She noticed that the ground below the cabin, where she could see it through a gap, was packed hard everywhere, but along that one seam where it had been disturbed and tamped down again. She noticed that the hearthstones bore a long, pale scratch where something heavy had been dragged across them and away. Most of all, she noticed the smell. Under the cold ash and the dust there was a faint resinous sweetness, the smell of cedar and pine pitch, and that was the smell of a fir cache, the cedar to turn the moth, the pitch to seal out the damp. Somewhere in this swept and stripped and sworn empty cabin, a man had built a place to hide the work of his hands, and someone had come looking for it, and from the careful way the ground was tamped and the boards reset, she did not think they had found it. She did not tear up the floor that day either. She wanted to know whose floor it was first. The dead man's name, she learned at the spur from an old freighter who remembered him, had been Mateo Reyes, though everyone had called him Tig for a reason no one could recall. He had run a trap line up the Bitterroot Fork for better than 30 years. A careful, solitary man who graded his own fur and would not be cheated, and who had quarreled more than once with the fur concern over the price of a bale. He had come up from the Mexican country as a young man and married, and lost his wife to a fever, and raised a daughter alone, and the daughter had married and gone down to the river settlements, and there had been a granddaughter. The freighter was sure of the granddaughter. He had seen the child once brought up to the cabin one summer, a small, dark-eyed girl who trailed the old trapper everywhere and called to him in 2 languages. Then Tig Reyes had died, the winter before last, found stiff in the first hard snow with his foot through the river ice, and the cabin had stood empty, and the fur concern had taken it for the back debt Tig was said to owe, and sold it on. Said to owe the freighter, set down those 2 words and then looked away, and Tess marked the look. A man who has run a careful line for 30 years and graded his own fur and refused to be cheated does not die owing money to the men he refused. He dies with money owed to him, or with the fur to make it. She thought of the swept shelves and the tamped ground and the cedar smell, and she began, very quietly, to be angry, in the slow, banked way that a coal is hot under ash. There was a granddaughter. The concern had sold the place as one whose owner had died without kin. Those 2 facts could not both be true, and Otho had shown her what to do when 2 facts could not both be true. You do not argue, you do not accuse. You find the thing that proves which one is the lie, and you let the thing speak, because a thing cannot be shouted down the way a person can. She found the granddaughter before she found the cash, which was the right order, though she did not plan it so. The girl was not a girl any longer. Celia Reyes was a young woman of perhaps 20, working in the kitchen of the railroad boarding house, down at the spur, sending what she could to no one, because there was no one left to send it to. Tess did not go to her with a story. She went to her with a question. She asked whether her grandfather had graded his own fur, and how, and the young woman's face changed, because it was not the question anyone asked. He had his marks, Ella said. She remembered them from when she was small, the little crosses and nicks he inked on his slips, his own private grades that the buyers could not read, and so could not argue with. He kept a book, she said, a tally book with brass on the corners. He wrote everything in it, every pelt, every grade, every price he was owed, and every price he was paid in his own hand and his own marks, so that no man could ever tell him he had been paid when he had not. She had watched him write in it by the fire. Then she said the thing that turned the whole matter over like a stone. When he died, she had asked the company for his book and his account, because she was his blood and the law allowed her to ask, and the factor A soft-spoken, broad man in a good coat had told her gently that there was no book, that her grandfather had kept no records, that the cabin had been searched and found empty, and that her grandfather had died owing more than the place was worth, and that there was nothing for her, no kin claim worth the filing, nothing at all. There was no book. Voss had sworn it to the granddaughter's face, and the granddaughter had believed him because she was 19 and grieving, and had no way to read a swept floor. Tess rode back up the Bitterroot Fork that evening with the anger gone cold and clean and useful, the way Otho had shown her to let it go. She did not tell Sella what she suspected, because a suspicion is a thing that can be taken away from you, and she did not want to hand the girl a hope that a man like Voss could pry out of her hands as easily as he had pried the cabin from her grandfather's name. She would find the thing first. Then there would be no suspicion to argue, only the thing itself, lying in the lamplight, saying what it said. It is worth stopping here to say plainly what kind of man the factor was, because he was not a simple thief, and the story is not honest if it makes him one. He did not break into cabins by night. He did it by paper and by patience, which is harder to see and far harder to undo. He found the solitary ones, the careful old trappers with no near kin and a quarrel in their history, and he waited for the cold to take them, and when it did, he was the first man up the trail. He searched their places himself, or sent men he trusted, and he carried off what could be carried, and burned what could be read, and then he wrote a bill of sale and an account of debt, and an affidavit that there was no heir, and he filed the paper at the county seat, where the clerk was an easy friend. And the paper became the truth, because there was no one left who could read the floor and say otherwise. He had done it to 4 trappers that Tess would later learn of, and he had grown comfortable and well-coated on it, and he had made one error with Tig Reyes that he did not yet know he had made. He had searched the cabin. He had not found the cash. And then, careless with success, he had sold the cabin to the one buyer in the territory who could tell the difference between bare and empty. She opened the floor on a cold, clear night in the first week of October, when the larch on the hillsides had gone the color of beaten gold and the nights had teeth. She did it at night, not from fear, but from care. She wanted the lamp because a low flame throws a raking light that shows every seam and shadow the flat noon washes out, and Otho had always said, "You do close work by lamplight," because the lamp tells you the truth about a surface that the sun is too generous to tell. She lifted the first short board and set it aside without a sound. The ground beneath was packed, but along one edge it gave to the point of her knife where everywhere else it was hard, and she worked the loose edge, and found that it was not earth at all below the first inch, but a fitted, wooden lid, cedar dark with age and faintly sweet, sat flush and covered over, so that a probe driven straight down would strike wood, and a careless searcher would take that wood for the underside of the floor, and dig no further. That was exactly what had happened. She could see in the low light the old dents where a steel probe had been driven down again and again across the cache and had each time struck the false lid and been taken for the floor. Voss's men had stood on the very thing they were hunting and called the room empty. She did not hurry even then. She cleared the lid with her hands, brushing the cold soil away, and she found the 2 leather pulls set into it, and she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cedar, feeling the cold come up out of it, the particular cold of air that has been sealed away from the world a long time. Then she lifted the lid. The smell came up first. Cedar and pine pitch, and the deep animal richness of prime fur, cold and clean. Air that had not stirred in more than a year. The lamp showed her the inside of the cache, as the old trapper had left it the last autumn of his life, before he walked down to the river and put his foot through the ice and did not walk back. There were bales of fur wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with sinew, and when she opened the pelts inside were marten, prime winter marten, dark and dense and unmarred, the best she had ever put her hands on, a fortune in fur lying in the cold like something asleep. There was fisher, and there was otter, and there was a single wolverine, all of it graded and bundled by a man who knew exactly what he had. And lying on top of the furs, wrapped in a square of waxed cloth against the damp, was a book with brass on its corners. Her hands shook a little when she lifted it, and she let them, because there are things a steady hand has no business pretending not to feel. She opened the tally book in the lamplight, and there it was, page after page in a careful hand, every pelt and every season and every grade marked in the private shorthand of an honest dealer, the small crosses and nicks she had learned at the old man's bench 1,000 miles away and 20 years before. Two men she had never seen in the same room, the dead Norwegian and the dead Mexican, had used nearly the same marks for nearly the same reasons, because the honest of every trait speak in the end the same language, and she could read every line of it as easily as her own name. On the last written page, in a hand that had begun to shake, the way an old man's hand shakes in his final winter, Tigres had written down what he was owed and by whom. He had written that the fur concern at the spur had taken 3 bales of prime marten from him the winter before on the promise of a fair price, and had paid him 1/4 of the grade and called it the whole. He had written the factor's name. He had written the true grade of every pelt in his own marks, so that no man could say he had been mistaken. And he had written, in plain words at the bottom, that if anything befell him, the cabin and the line and all that was owed should pass to his granddaughter, named there in full, the only blood he had left, and that he had hidden this account where no thieving company hand would think to dig, under the 3rd board from the hearth. Because a man who could not be cheated alive could at least see to it he was not cheated dead. Tess sat on the cold floor, with the book open in her lap, and the cash open at her knee, and the lamp burning low, and she understood that she was holding the one thing in the world the factor had sworn did not exist. He had told the granddaughter there was no book. He had filed paper at the county seat saying there was no heir. He had built his comfortable life on the certainty that the floor would never be read. And the floor had been read. What she felt then was not triumph. Otho had taught her to distrust triumph, which he said was a feeling that made people careless at the exact moment they needed care most. What she felt was the weight of the thing, and the knowledge that holding the truth and proving it were 2 different labors, and that the second would be harder than prying the floor. A man like Voss did not give up his comfort because a thing was true. He gave it up only when the thing was true in front of witnesses he could not buy, and on paper he could not burn. She closed the cash and reset the board, went down the next morning to find the granddaughter, and on the ride down she made her plan, and the plan had nothing in it of accusation or revenge. It had only the thing and the right eyes to see it. The factor heard of her interest before she was ready, because a town that small keeps no secrets long, and a furrier girl asking the county clerk how a kin claim was filed is the kind of question that travels. He did not panic. He was not a man who panicked. He sent 2 of his men up to the cabin by daylight openly, with a writ of trespass he had drawn up himself, claiming the cabin and everything in or under it was the property of the concern and that the woman living there had no right to disturb the ground. It was a clever stroke. If he could get his hands on the cash before any official eye saw it, he could make the whole matter vanish the way the old trapper had vanished, and call her a liar and a trespasser, and there would be no book because there had never been a book. He had not reckoned that she had already moved the only part of it that could not be replaced. She had carried the tally book down to the spur the morning after she found it, wrapped in the same waxed cloth, and she had not hidden it in any place a company hand might think to dig. She had given it to the one person whose claim it proved, and she had told Selah to keep it close against her body and show it to no one until the day they could show it to everyone at once. The furs she had left in the cache resealed under the board, because the furs were heavy and the book was the proof, and a man who came to steal would tear up the floor for the fur and never miss the one thing that mattered. When the factor's men pried up the third board from the hearth that afternoon and hauled out the bales of prime marten in the flat light of day, they were carrying off the very fur the book recorded, and every pelt they bore down the trail was another line of evidence, in a hand they could not read, marked in a shorthand that named the grade and named the thief. The lowest part of it came 3 days later. Was, finding the cache emptied of its book, and understanding at last what kind of buyer he had handed the place to, did the things such men do when paper begins to fail them. He went to Selah at the boarding house, soft-spoken and broad in his good coat, and he sat across the kitchen table from a young woman alone, and he offered to settle. He told her gently that there were debts, that the matter was tangled, that a girl in her position could spend years and every dollar she did not have fighting a company in a court that favored the company, and lose. He offered her a sum of money to sign away the claim. It was a generous sum to a woman who washed dishes for her bread. It was a thief's price for a fortune in fur and a grandfather's good name. And the cruelty of it was precise, because he had timed it for the moment she was most alone and most tired and most afraid, and a frightened person will sign away the truth for the simple relief of being let alone. Selah did not sign, yet she came to Tess afterward with her hands shaking, and she said that she had nearly signed, that the man had been so certain and so kind, and she had been so tired, and that she did not know how a girl who washed dishes could stand in a court against the man who owned the biggest building in town. For a moment, in the cold cabin, with the wind coming down off the high country, even Tess felt the path forward close, because the granddaughter was right. The truth was on their side, and the truth was not enough. The truth had been on Tig Reyes's side too, and it had not kept him from being cheated alive, or robbed dead. She sat with that a long while. Then she did what the old man had taught her to do, when a thing seemed impossible, which was to stop staring at the whole of it, and look instead at the one small part she could actually put her hands on. She could not outspend the factor. She could not outtalk him. She could, however, read fur, and he could not. And that single fact was the crack in the wall. Voss had hauled the 3 bales of dark winter fur out of the cache in broad daylight, in front of his own men and a freighter or two who happened to be on the road. He had carried that fur down to his own warehouse at the spur, and it sat there now, his by force, graded in a dead man's private marks that matched, mark for mark, the marks in the book the granddaughter carried against her body. The fur and the book together said one thing and only one thing, and no court in the territory could be made to unsee it, once the two were laid side by side. What she needed was to lay them side by side in front of eyes the factor could not buy. The chance came with the fall fur sale, the one day of the year the valley filled with buyers from the eastern houses, men who came west with money and judgment and no loyalty to a local factor, men whose whole trade was the reading of fur and the keeping of honest grade. They gathered at the warehouse at the spur, and Voss laid out his stock for them. The best he had, and among the best because he could not help himself, were the 3 bales of prime bitterroot marten he had hauled out of the cache. He did not know they could be read. He believed that fur was only fur once the man who trapped it was dead. Tess came to the sale openly, with the granddaughter beside her and the brass-cornered book in Selah's hands. And she did not make a speech because Otho had taught her that a thing proven needs no speech, and a thing unproven is not helped by one. She asked the Eastern buyers plainly whether they would grade a bale with her, one furrier to another, as a matter of trade. They were curious, and curious men are generous with an hour, and they agreed. She opened the bale of prime marten that the factor had set out as his own, and she graded it pelt by pelt aloud, calling each grade before she turned the skin, and on the flesh side of each pelt, pressed into the leather where a trapper marks his own, was Tigreus's private sign naming the grade exactly as she had called it. Then she had Selah open the book to the page where Tig had set down those same 3 bales, in those same marks, the winter before he died, and the buyers leaned in and read the two together, the mark on the leather and the mark on the page, and they were the same hand. And the page named the grade and named the price promised and named the quarter price paid and named the factor who had paid it. There was no shouting. Otho had been right about that too. The Eastern buyers were quiet men, and they went very quiet, and one of them, the eldest, a buyer named Whitcomb, with 40 years of grade behind him, turned the marten over in his thick hands and read the mark and looked at the page, and then looked at the factor across the warehouse for a long, level moment. He did not accuse him. He only said in the flat administrative voice of a man stating a fact for the record that he would not be buying any fur out of this house this year, nor would the house he spoke for, until the matter of the grade and the trapper's account was answered to the county. The other buyers one by one set down the pelts they had been holding, and the warehouse emptied of buyers the way a room empties of warmth when a door is left standing open, and Harlan Voss stood among his stolen bales with no one left to sell them to, and the painted name on his building gone suddenly worth nothing at all. He looked, that moment, at the woman who had undone him, and for the first time and the only time his soft-spoken certainty failed him. He understood, the way a man understands a thing all at once and too late, that he had sold the cabin to the one person in the territory who could read what he could not, that every careful theft he had built his comfort on had rested on the plain wager that no one would ever come who could read the floor and the fur and the marks together, and that the wager had at last been lost, not to a court, not to a gun, not to luck, but to a furrier girl with chapped hands and a dead man's knife and a skill he had not thought to fear. There was nothing he could say that the fur had not already said better. He turned and went into his office and shut the door, and that was the last of him that mattered to the story, because her teacher had shown her that the wrongdoer is never the point. That you do not stay to watch a man fall, you turn instead to the one who is wronged, and you set the thing right. The county did the rest in its slow paper way, but the county only put its stamp on what the warehouse had already decided. The affidavit of no heir was withdrawn because there was an heir, and she had stood in the warehouse with her grandfather's book in her hands. The account of debt was reversed because the book in the dead man's own marks showed the debt running the other way, that it was the concern who owed the trapper for those 3 bales paid at a quarter of grade, and the Eastern buyer's word on the true grade settled the sum past argument. The cabin and the trapline and the cache of prime winter fur passed to Celarius, who was the trapper's blood and his named heir, exactly as he had written by his failing fire in the last autumn of his life, hiding the account under the 3rd board from the hearth because a man who could not be cheated alive had meant to see he was not cheated dead. And he had not been. It had only taken 2 winters and the right pair of hands. Tess did not keep the fur, though some in the valley assumed she would, having found it, and a few even said she was owed it. She had not labored for the fur. She gave the book and the cash and the cabin to the granddaughter, and kept for herself only the thing she had come west with, which was the trade in her hands, and one marten pelt that Selah pressed on her, the finest in the cache, prime and dark and graded by the trapper's own mark. which Tess took because to refuse it would have been a different kind of pride. She dressed it that winter and kept it, and it lay across the foot of her bed in the cabin she went on living in. The cabin she had bought for $9, and the seller had sworn was empty, where every night the wind came down off the high country and pressed against the log walls, and the walls answered with the small ticking sounds old timber made. Selah did not go back to washing dishes at the boarding house. She took up her grandfather's trapline the next season, and Tess taught her what the old Norwegian had taught her, the grades and the seasons and the private marks, the whole patient language of an honest trade, so that the marks Tigreas had pressed into his leather did not die with him but went on being read and written by his own blood. The two women ran their lines on opposite forks of the same creek and graded their fur together by lamplight through the long winters, and the eastern buyers came to the spur each fall and paid them honest grade, because honest grade was now the only kind that could be sold there, the great sign on the big building having come down within the year, the man who had owned it having sold out cheap and gone east where his history did not follow him. Years on, when Selah had a daughter of her own, and the daughter was old enough to trail her up the trail and call to her in two languages, the way Selah had once trailed her grandfather, there was a thing the women did each autumn that the valley grew used to and never wholly understood. Before the first hard snow, they would go up to the original cabin, the one Tess had bought for $9, and they would lift the short plank by the hearthstones and open the cedar lid and let the cold seal there come up into the lamplight and look into the empty cache a while, and then close it and reset the board. They were not hiding anything there anymore. There was nothing left to hide. They opened it only to remember that a thing the world has sworn is worthless may be the very thing that holds the truth, and that the floor a careless man stands on and calls bare can be the floor that, read by an honest eye, undoes him. Tess Marlowe grew old in that valley, and she dressed fur until her hands could no longer hold the knife, and she taught the trade to anyone with the patience to learn it. And she never once stood up in a public place and told the story of how she had brought down the man with the painted name, because the old man had taught her that a person who has truly won a thing has no need to be heard saying so. The fur said it. The book said it. The floor had said it on a cold, clear night in October, when she set her shoulder behind the bar and the square nails lifted and the cedar smell came up out of the dark. On the last winter of her own life, she gave the honey-handled skinning knife to Selah's daughter, who was a furrier by then in her own right, and she gave with it the only teaching that had ever truly mattered, the same one the old Norwegian had given her in a shed that smelled of bark and lime a lifetime before. Look at the thing in front of you until it tells you the truth. Do not let any man tell it for you. And when a careful place has been swept too clean and a smooth-spoken man swears it is empty, get down on your knees and read the floor, because the bare places are the ones with the most left to say, and the truth, even buried under a board and sworn against by every man with something to lose, is patient, and it keeps, and it waits in the cold for the first honest hand to come and lift the lid.